What if everything you thought you knew about the Garden of Gethsemane was just the beginning of a far deeper mystery? What if the most pivotal night in human history holds secrets that have been hidden beneath centuries of tradition and assumption? Tonight, we're going to uncover archaeological evidence that will shake your understanding of where Jesus spent his final hours of freedom. We're going to explore medical phenomena so rare that doctors still debate whether what happened that night was even humanly possible. And we're going to reveal discoveries made just months ago that confirm details the gospel writers recorded 2,000 years ago. This isn't just another retelling of a familiar story. This is an investigation into one of the most scrutinized locations on Earth, where recent archaeological breakthroughs have stunned the scientific community and validated biblical accounts in ways no one expected. The Garden of Gethsemane isn't just a place where Jesus prayed. It's a location where the physical and spiritual realms collided with such intensity that it left marks we can still examine today. But here's what will surprise you most. The name Gethsemane itself holds a prophetic meaning that most people have never discovered. When you understand what this place was really used for, and why Jesus chose to spend his final night there, the entire narrative takes on a significance that will leave you speechless. We're talking about archaeological evidence discovered by accident during construction work. We're talking about olive trees whose DNA tells a story spanning centuries. We're talking about medical conditions so extraordinary that they've only been documented a handful of times in all of human history. If you're ready to discover what really happened in the Garden of Gethsemane, drop a Y in the comments. And make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the most important night in the Christian faith. This journey will take you deeper than Sunday school ever did, revealing layers of meaning that connect ancient agricultural practices to divine prophecy, medical science to spiritual anguish, and archaeological discovery to biblical truth. Let's step into the darkness of that spring night 2,000 years ago and uncover what really happened in Gethsemane. Picture this. It's approximately 30 AD, and the bustling city of Jerusalem is packed with Passover pilgrims. The narrow streets echo with the voices of travelers from across the Roman Empire, all gathered to celebrate the most sacred feast in the Jewish calendar. But as the sun sets and the crowds settle into their temporary accommodations, a small group of men quietly makes their way out of the city, crossing the Kidron Valley toward the Mount of Olives. Leading this group is Jesus of Nazareth, and the destination they're heading toward is a place called Gethsemane. Now most people hear that name and immediately picture a peaceful garden with flowering trees and grassy pathways. But what if I told you that the very name Gethsemane reveals something far more profound about what was about to unfold? The word Gethsemane comes from the Aramaic gadsman, or the Hebrew gath shamanim, which literally translates to oil press. This wasn't just a garden where people went to enjoy nature. This was an active commercial olive oil production facility. Imagine the noise of heavy millstones grinding olives, the sound of wooden beams creaking under enormous pressure, and workers calling out instructions as they extracted liquid gold from countless olives. But here's where it gets interesting from a prophetic standpoint. Olive oil in ancient times wasn't just cooking oil. It was the sacred substance used to anoint kings, priests, and prophets. It was the oil that burned in the temple lamps, symbolizing the eternal presence of God. And it was produced through an incredibly violent process where olives were crushed, pressed, and subjected to enormous pressure until every drop of precious oil was extracted. Think about the irony of this moment. Jesus, who would later be called the Anointed One, the Christ, the Messiah, chose to spend his final night of freedom in a place literally dedicated to the crushing and pressing required to produce anointing oil. This wasn't coincidence. This was divine appointment. Recent archaeological discoveries have revolutionized our understanding of what Gethsemane actually looked like during Jesus' time. In 2012, the Italian National Research Council conducted DNA testing on the ancient olive trees still standing in the garden today. What they found was remarkable. All the tested trees came from the same parent plant, suggesting that early Christian caretakers deliberately propagated trees from original stock, possibly preserving the genetic lineage of trees that were contemporary with Jesus. But here's what makes this discovery even more significant. The first-century historian Josephus documented that Roman forces cut down and destroyed all the trees around Jerusalem during their siege in 70 AD. This means the trees we see today aren't the original trees, but they may very well be descendants of the trees that provided shade for Jesus and his disciples on that fateful night. The carbon dating revealed that 3 of the current olive trees date to 1092, 1166, and 1198 AD, making them among the oldest scientifically verified trees on Earth. While these trees postdate Jesus by over a millennium, their presence demonstrates an unbroken tradition of preservation at this sacred site. Early Christians clearly went to extraordinary lengths to maintain continuity with the original location. But the most stunning archaeological discovery happened completely by accident in 2023. During construction of a new visitor center, workers broke through into an underground cavity. What they found inside changed everything we thought we knew about Gethsemane. Hidden beneath centuries of soil and debris was a Second Temple-era mikveh, a Jewish ritual bath that dates precisely to the time of Jesus. Amit Reim, the Israel Antiquities Authority's Jerusalem district head, made this remarkable statement. For the first time, we have archaeological evidence that something was here in the Second Temple period, in the days of Jesus. This discovery is groundbreaking because previous excavations at the site since 1919 had failed to uncover any evidence from Jesus' era. For over a century, archaeologists had been digging at Gethsemane without finding a single artifact that could definitively connect the site to the 1st century. But why would there be a ritual bath at an olive oil production facility? The answer reveals something profound about the religious significance of olive oil in Jewish culture. According to Jewish law, workers involved in oil and wine production were required to purify themselves ritually. The presence of this mikveh confirms that Gethsemane wasn't just any oil press. It was a facility operating under strict religious guidelines, producing oil that would be used for sacred purposes. This archaeological evidence validates something the Gospel writers recorded, but that scholars have debated for centuries. The Gospels describe Jesus and his disciples as being familiar with Gethsemane, suggesting they had visited there before. If this was indeed a functioning olive oil facility with religious significance, it makes perfect sense that a Jewish rabbi and his followers would have known about it and possibly even used it as a regular meeting place. The layout of ancient Gethsemane was far more complex than most people realize. Archaeological evidence suggests the site included not just open garden areas, but also cave systems used for oil production. One cave, measuring approximately 36 by 60 feet, shows clear evidence of having housed olive pressing equipment. The cave's central chamber was large enough for crushing basins with millstones, and there are indications that it may have contained not 1 but 2 complete olive presses. This cave discovery has led some scholars to reconsider exactly where the events of that night took place. The Gospel of John contains an intriguing detail that most people overlook. When the arrest party arrives, John records that Jesus went out to meet them. The Greek word used suggests he emerged from within something, not simply from among trees in open garden. Could it be that Jesus and his disciples had taken shelter in the cave during the cool spring night? This would make practical sense, especially considering that Jerusalem nights in early spring can be quite chilly. The cave would have provided warmth and privacy for the intense spiritual battle Jesus was about to face. Early Christian pilgrims seem to have understood this detail. The nun Egeria, who toured the Holy Land around 382 AD, describes pilgrims being provided with candles when they visited Gethsemane so that they can all see. This strongly suggests that at least part of the pilgrimage experience took place in a cave or enclosed space rather than an open garden. The combination of cave and garden areas helps explain the apparent contradictions in various gospel accounts. Some describe Jesus praying among olive trees under the stars, while others suggest a more enclosed setting. The reality is that Gethsemane encompassed both environments, providing Jesus with options for privacy and contemplation as his emotional and spiritual distress intensified throughout the night. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the Gethsemane discovery involves the symbolism embedded in the very purpose of the location. An olive press operates through a process of systematic crushing. Olives are first crushed by heavy millstones, then placed in woven bags and subjected to enormous pressure from wooden beams weighted down with stones. The pressure is applied gradually, intensifying over time, until every possible drop of oil is extracted. The parallel to what Jesus experienced that night is impossible to ignore. As he contemplated the weight of humanity's sin, the reality of separation from his Father, and the physical agony of crucifixion, the pressure on his soul intensified to a breaking point. Like olives in the press, he was being crushed under a weight that would have destroyed any ordinary person. This crushing process in olive oil production had to be thorough and complete. If any oil remained in the pulp, the entire batch would be considered inferior. Similarly, Jesus' sacrifice had to be complete and perfect. Every drop of suffering had to be endured. Every aspect of humanity's debt had to be paid. The location itself was prophesying the necessity and completeness of what was about to unfold. The medical implications of what happened in Gethsemane that night have puzzled physicians for centuries and continue to generate intense debate in medical journals today. According to Luke's Gospel, Jesus' anguish was so intense that his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. For nearly 2,000 years, skeptics dismissed this as metaphorical language or poetic exaggeration. But modern medicine has identified and documented a rare condition called hematidrosis, where capillary blood vessels feeding the sweat glands rupture under conditions of extreme physical or emotional stress. The medical literature confirms that this phenomenon, while extraordinarily rare, is physiologically possible and has been observed in patients facing extreme trauma or impending death. What makes this detail even more significant is that Luke, the gospel writer who recorded it, was himself a physician. His medical training would have made him acutely aware of unusual physiological phenomena. When Luke describes Jesus' condition as agony, he uses the Greek word agonia, a technical medical term that he alone among the gospel writers employs. The process of hematidrosis begins when stress causes blood vessels around sweat glands to constrict. As anxiety increases, these vessels dilate to the point of rupture, forcing blood into the sweat glands where it mixes with perspiration and emerges as bloody sweat. The condition typically occurs in patients facing torture, death, or severe ongoing trauma. But hematidrosis has another effect that becomes crucial for understanding what Jesus endured in the hours that followed. The condition leaves the skin extremely tender and fragile, exponentially increasing sensitivity to pain. This means that the scourging, the crown of thorns, and the crucifixion itself would have been far more agonizing for someone who had experienced this rare medical condition. The fact that this physiological detail, recorded by a first-century physician, aligns perfectly with modern medical understanding of stress-induced hematidrosis provides powerful validation for the gospel accounts. Luke wasn't writing fiction or embellishing for dramatic effect. He was documenting a genuine medical phenomenon that he witnessed or learned about from reliable eyewitness sources. As we continue our investigation into what really happened in Gethsemane, we'll discover how the archaeological evidence, the medical phenomena, and the prophetic symbolism all converge to paint a picture of that night that's far more complex and profound than most people have ever imagined. The physical location, the spiritual battle, and the human drama all interweave to create a story that challenges our understanding of both history and faith. But we've only begun to scratch the surface of this mystery. There are still questions about the timing of events, the identity of the arrest party, and the political implications of what transpired. There are ancient traditions and modern discoveries that shed new light on familiar details. And there are theological implications that connect this single night to the entire sweep of human history. What we've uncovered so far is just the foundation. The real revelations are still to come, and they will transform your understanding of the most pivotal night in human history. The deeper we dig into the events of that night, the more we realize that what happened in Gethsemane wasn't just a moment of prayer before betrayal. It was the epicenter of a cosmic battle that had been building since the foundation of the world. And the evidence we're uncovering suggests that everything about that location, that timing, and those circumstances was orchestrated with precision that defies human explanation. Let's talk about the arrest itself, because recent scholarship has revealed details that most people have never heard. According to the Gospel of John, when the arrest party arrived at Gethsemane, they came with lanterns, torches, and weapons. This wasn't a small group of temple guards making a quiet arrest. This was a military operation involving both Jewish authorities and Roman soldiers. But here's what's fascinating. John records that when Jesus identified himself to the arresting party, saying, "I am he," the entire group fell backward to the ground. Think about that for a moment. Hardened Roman soldiers, temple guards trained for crowd control, and religious officials all simultaneously knocked off their feet by two simple words. This wasn't fear or surprise. This was a demonstration of divine power that even Jesus' enemies couldn't deny. The Greek phrase Jesus used was ego eimi, which translates literally as "I am." This is the same phrase used in the Greek translation of Exodus when God reveals his name to Moses as "I am that I am." Jesus wasn't just identifying himself as the person they were looking for. He was declaring his divine identity with such authority that it had physical effects on everyone present. What's remarkable is that after this display of power, Jesus voluntarily submitted to arrest. He could have walked away. He could have called legions of angels. He could have left his captors lying on the ground indefinitely. Instead, he allowed them to bind him and lead him away. This wasn't weakness. This was the ultimate demonstration of strength under control. The timing of the arrest also reveals careful planning on multiple levels. The Jewish leaders had been looking for an opportunity to arrest Jesus without causing a public riot. The Passover crowds were sympathetic to Jesus, and any attempt to arrest him publicly could have sparked an uprising. Judas provided them with the perfect solution: a location where Jesus could be found away from the crowds, in the darkness of night. But there's another layer to the timing that most people miss. The Passover celebration wasn't just about remembering Israel's deliverance from Egypt. It was about the sacrificial lamb whose blood protected the firstborn from the angel of death. The timing of Jesus' arrest, just hours after the Passover meal, was setting up the ultimate fulfillment of what that ancient sacrifice had symbolized. The Gospel writers make it clear that Jesus knew exactly what was coming. He had predicted his betrayal, his arrest, his crucifixion, and his resurrection multiple times. This wasn't a man caught off guard by circumstances beyond his control. This was someone walking deliberately into a trap he could have avoided, because avoiding it would have meant abandoning the mission he came to fulfill. The presence of Roman soldiers in the arrest party tells us something crucial about the political dimensions of what was happening. The Jewish authorities alone had the power to arrest someone for religious violations, but they brought Roman military support for a reason. They understood that arresting Jesus carried the risk of civil unrest, and they wanted overwhelming force available if needed. This Roman involvement also reveals how threatened the establishment felt by Jesus' influence. He wasn't just a religious teacher with a small following. He was someone whose movement had grown large enough and influential enough to concern both religious and political authorities. The fact that they felt the need for a military-style operation to arrest one unarmed man speaks volumes about the power they recognized in him. The location of the arrest adds another dimension to the story. Gethsemane was located on the Mount of Olives, directly across the Kidron Valley from the temple. From where Jesus was praying, he would have had a clear view of the temple complex. illuminated by the fires that burned continuously on the altar. He was looking across at the very place where countless animal sacrifices had been offered as temporary coverings for sin, knowing that he was about to become the final, perfect sacrifice that would make all those previous offerings obsolete. The symbolism becomes even more profound when you consider the route the arrest party would have taken. They came from Jerusalem, crossed the Kidron Valley, and climbed up to Gethsemane. This is the same valley that King David crossed when he fled from his son Absalom's rebellion, weeping as he went. David's betrayal by his own son prefigured the betrayal Jesus would experience from Judas, one of his chosen 12. The Kidron Valley also held prophetic significance in Jewish thought. The prophet Joel had written about a future day when God would gather all nations in the valley for judgment. Jesus' arrest in the vicinity of this valley was another layer of prophetic fulfillment that the gospel writers understood and wanted their readers to recognize. But let's return to the physical evidence and what it tells us about the actual events of that night. The cave system at Gethsemane provides clues about how Jesus and his disciples might have spent their time there. If they were indeed using the caves for shelter, it would explain how the arrest party was able to locate them so precisely in the darkness. Judas knew their habits. He knew where they typically went when they left Jerusalem for the night. The fact that he could lead the authorities directly to their location suggests this wasn't a random choice of hiding places, but familiar retreat that Jesus and his disciples had used before. The practical aspects of the location also support the gospel accounts. The olive groves provided natural concealment from anyone approaching from Jerusalem. The caves offered shelter from the cool night air. The location was close enough to the city for easy access, but far enough away to provide privacy for prayer and discussion. Recent archaeological work has revealed additional details about the infrastructure around Gethsemane during the 1st century. There were paths, terraces, and stone walls that created a complex landscape very different from the simple garden that most people envision. This was a working agricultural site with the infrastructure necessary to support large-scale olive oil production. The workers who operated the olive presses would have been familiar with the rhythms of harvest season, when olives were gathered and processed around the clock. The timing of Jesus' arrest during Passover week means this would have been outside the harvest season, making the location relatively quiet and private. The discovery of the mikveh adds another layer to our understanding of who might have had access to this location. The requirement for ritual purification suggests this wasn't just any commercial enterprise. This was a facility that served religious purposes, possibly connected to the temple itself or to the production of oil for sacred uses. This connection to temple worship creates an additional parallel to what Jesus was experiencing that night. He was preparing for the ultimate act of worship, the perfect sacrifice that would fulfill everything the temple system had been pointing toward. The location where this preparation took place was itself connected to the sacred oil that anointed priests and kings and burned in the temple lamps. The olive trees themselves become symbols in this narrative. These ancient plants, with their ability to regenerate from their roots even after the trunk is cut down, represent resurrection and eternal life. The fact that Jesus chose to spend his final night among olive trees takes on additional significance when you consider that he would soon demonstrate the ultimate example of life triumphing over death. The DNA evidence showing that the current trees descended from a common ancestor suggests that someone in the early Christian community understood the importance of preserving not just the location, but the actual genetic heritage of the site. This level of intentional preservation indicates how significant early Christians considered this place to be. Modern pilgrims to Gethsemane often comment on the profound sense of peace they experienced there, despite knowing about the anguish Jesus endured on that spot. Perhaps this peace comes from understanding that the crushing and pressing that took place, there wasn't the end of the story, but the necessary prelude to resurrection and victory. The medical phenomenon of hematidrosis that we discussed earlier has been documented in other historical figures facing extreme stress. But what makes Jesus' case unique is the context and the completeness of the gospel record. Luke's account includes details about the appearance of an angel to strengthen Jesus, the intensity of his prayer, and the specific nature of this physical distress. This angelic intervention raises questions about the invisible spiritual battle that was taking place alongside the visible human drama. The gospel writers make it clear that what was happening in Gethsemane wasn't just about human emotions and physical stress. There were cosmic forces at work, with eternal consequences hanging in the balance. The strengthening that came from the angel didn't remove Jesus' distress, but apparently enabled him to endure it more completely. This suggests that the anguish he experienced was necessary for the mission he came to accomplish. The crushing and pressing had to be thorough and complete, just like the process required to extract every drop of oil from olives. As we piece together all these elements, the archaeological evidence, the medical phenomena, the prophetic symbolism, and the historical context, a picture emerges of that night that's far more complex and meaningful than a simple story of prayer and betrayal. Every detail seems to have been orchestrated to fulfill ancient prophecies while establishing the foundation for everything that would follow. But there are still more layers to uncover, more connections to explore, and more implications to consider. The events of that night in Gethsemane set in motion a sequence of events that would culminate in the most significant weekend in human history. And the evidence suggests that nothing about those events was left to chance. The arrest of Jesus in Gethsemane reveals layers of prophetic fulfillment that become more remarkable the deeper we examine them. Consider this. The very disciples who had sworn to die with Jesus fled into the darkness the moment danger arrived. Peter, who had boldly declared he would never deny his master, managed only a single sword stroke before abandoning his Lord entirely. This wasn't cowardice. This was the fulfillment of ancient prophecy. Zechariah had written centuries earlier, "Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered." Jesus himself had quoted this prophecy to his disciples just hours before, warning them that they would all fall away. Yet when the moment came, they seemed genuinely surprised by their own failure. How often do we find ourselves acting exactly as God predicted we would, even when we're convinced we'll respond differently? The Gospel of Mark includes a peculiar detail that most people overlook. A young man was following Jesus, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. When the guards tried to seize him, he fled naked, leaving the cloth behind. This strange addition to the narrative has puzzled scholars for centuries. Why would Mark include such an embarrassing detail unless it was significant? Some scholars believe this young man was Mark himself, providing an eyewitness account of his own humiliating flight from the scene. Others suggest it was a wealthy young man from Jerusalem who had been secretly following Jesus' movements. But there's a deeper symbolic meaning here that connects to ancient Jewish practices. The linen cloth was likely a burial shroud, the kind used to wrap bodies for burial. This young man, possibly awakened by the commotion and grabbing the first covering he could find, inadvertently brought a symbol of death into the scene. When he fled naked, leaving the shroud behind, it foreshadowed what would happen to Jesus. Death would be left behind, and life would emerge triumphant. The route taken by the arrest party as they led Jesus back to Jerusalem tells its own story. They didn't take the most direct path. Instead, they brought him through the Kidron Valley, past the Garden tombs, and up toward the city through the area where refuse was burned. Every step of this journey was loaded with symbolic meaning that the gospel writers wanted their readers to understand. The Kidron Valley was where King Josiah had burned the implements of idol worship when he cleansed the temple. It was where the ashes of pagan altars had been scattered. Now Jesus, who would become the ultimate sacrifice for idolatry and sin, was being led through this very valley. The place where false worship had been destroyed was witnessing the passage of the one who would establish true worship forever. Archaeological evidence from the 1st century reveals that this area was also used for disposing of sacrificial remains from the temple. Animal bones, ash from burnt offerings, and other ceremonial refuse were regularly dumped in the Kidron Valley. Jesus was being led to his death through a place that symbolized the end of the entire sacrificial system he was about to replace. The timing of these events becomes even more significant when you understand the precise chronology of Passover week. Jewish leaders were operating under strict time constraints. They needed to complete Jesus' trial and execution before the Sabbath began at sundown Friday. This wasn't just about religious observance. It was about fulfilling the prophetic requirement that the Passover lamb be sacrificed at the appointed time. The fact that they were able to orchestrate the arrest, multiple trials, and crucifixion within such a narrow window suggests careful planning that went beyond human coordination. Every detail had to align perfectly for the prophetic timeline to be fulfilled. The slightest delay could have pushed the crucifixion past the Passover, which would have destroyed the symbolic parallel between Jesus' death and the sacrificial lamb. But here's what most people don't realize about the arrest in Gethsemane. It wasn't just about capturing Jesus. It was about demonstrating his voluntary submission to the Father's will. Remember, Jesus had just displayed enough power to knock an entire arrest party to the ground with 2 words. He could have escaped at any moment. His willingness to be bound and led away was itself a crucial part of the sacrifice. This voluntary aspect becomes even more profound when you consider the garden setting. Gardens in Jewish thought represented places of choice and consequence. The first garden, Eden, was where humanity made the choice that brought death into the world. Now, in another garden, the second Adam was making the choice that would bring life back into the world. The parallel between Adam and Jesus in their respective gardens is impossible to miss. Adam was tempted by Satan and fell, bringing sin and death to all humanity. Jesus was tempted by Satan and triumphed, bringing righteousness and life to all who would believe. Adam hid from God after his failure. Jesus sought God's presence in his hour of greatest trial. Even the physical elements of the garden setting carry symbolic weight. Olive trees were symbols of peace, prosperity, and divine blessing in Jewish culture. The oil they produced was used to anoint kings and priests, designating them for sacred service. Jesus, surrounded by these trees on the night of his arrest, was being anointed not with oil but with suffering for his role as the ultimate king and high priest. The crushing process we discussed earlier takes on additional meaning when you consider that olive oil was also used medicinally in the ancient world. It was applied to wounds for healing, mixed with wine as an antiseptic, and used to treat various ailments. The crushing that Jesus endured in Gethsemane was producing the healing that would flow to wounded humanity for centuries to come. Recent studies of ancient olive pressing techniques have revealed just how violent and thorough the process really was. The olives weren't just squeezed gently. They were crushed by massive stones, ground to pulp, then subjected to increasing pressure over hours or even days. The process was designed to extract every possible drop of oil, leaving nothing of value in the refuse. This complete extraction parallels what Jesus experienced spiritually that night. Every aspect of human sin, every consequence of rebellion against God, every drop of divine wrath that humanity deserved was being pressed out of him. The process had to be complete. If any sin remained unaddressed, any wrath unabsorbed, the sacrifice would be incomplete and ineffective. The medical condition of hematidrosis that we examined earlier typically occurs in people who are facing certain death and feel powerless to prevent it. But Jesus wasn't powerless. He had demonstrated his authority over death multiple times, raising Lazarus, the widow's son, and Jairus' daughter. His anguish wasn't about fear of dying. It was about the spiritual reality of bearing the full weight of human sin. This distinction is crucial for understanding what really happened in Gethsemane. Jesus wasn't afraid of physical pain or even death itself. He was contemplating something infinitely worse: spiritual separation from his Father. For someone who had existed in perfect unity with God from eternity, The prospect of bearing sin and experiencing divine wrath was literally unbearable. The prayer Jesus prayed that night reveals the depth of his internal struggle. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will but yours be done." This wasn't a prayer of someone trying to escape his destiny. This was the prayer of someone wrestling with the costliest decision in the history of the universe. The cup Jesus referred to wasn't just crucifixion. In Old Testament imagery, the cup represented God's wrath poured out in judgment. Jesus was asking if there was any other way to accomplish redemption without drinking the full cup of divine wrath that human sin deserved. The answer, given through silence, was that there was no other way. This prayer was repeated 3 times, each with increasing intensity. The repetition wasn't because God didn't hear the first time. It was because the weight of the decision required multiple confirmations of Jesus' willingness to proceed. Each time he prayed, he was recommitting himself to the path that would lead through death to resurrection. The disciples' failure to stay awake during this crucial time has often been criticized, but it reveals something important about human nature under stress. When faced with situations beyond our comprehension or control, we often retreat into unconsciousness or denial. Sleep was their escape from a reality too overwhelming to process. But their sleep also fulfilled another prophetic purpose. It demonstrated that the work Jesus was about to accomplish couldn't be done by human effort or support. This was something he had to do alone, without help from his closest friends, without encouragement from those who loved him most. The salvation of humanity would rest entirely on his shoulders. The awakening of the disciples when the arrest party arrived symbolizes humanity's spiritual awakening to the significance of what was happening. Suddenly, the cosmic battle that had been raging in the spiritual realm became visible in the physical world. The time for sleeping was over. The hour of decision had arrived. As Jesus was led away from Gethsemane, bound and surrounded by his captors, he was leaving behind more than just a garden. He was leaving behind his final moments of freedom, his last opportunity to change course, his ultimate chance to choose comfort over sacrifice. The path ahead would lead through mockery, torture, and death to the resurrection that would transform everything. The archaeological evidence we've examined, the medical phenomena we've explored, and the prophetic symbolism we've uncovered all point to the same conclusion. What happened in Gethsemane wasn't just a historical event that occurred 2,000 years ago. It was the hinge point of history, the moment when eternity intersected with time, when divine love conquered human sin. But the story doesn't end with Jesus being led away in chains. The crushing and pressing that began in Gethsemane would continue through the crucifixion, but it would produce something more valuable than olive oil. It would produce the redemption that humanity desperately needed, the forgiveness that no amount of good works could earn, and the eternal life that death itself couldn't prevent. The garden where humanity fell would be answered by the garden where humanity's champion triumphed. The tree where Adam brought death would be answered by the tree where Jesus brought life. The crushing that seemed like defeat would prove to be the very mechanism of victory. And that's what really happened in the Garden of Gethsemane. It wasn't just prayer before betrayal. It wasn't just anguish before arrest. It was the moment when love proved stronger than fear, when obedience conquered rebellion, and when the salvation of the world hung in the balance of one man's willingness to drink a cup that no one else could even lift. The evidence we've uncovered tonight reveals that Gethsemane was far more than a simple garden where Jesus went to pray. It was a prophetic stage set by divine appointment, where every stone, every tree, every drop of oil pressed from countless olives had been preparing for this moment since the foundation of the world. The recent archaeological discoveries, the medical phenomena documented by a first-century physician, and the layers of prophetic symbolism embedded in the very name and purpose of this location all converge to tell us something profound. What happened in Gethsemane wasn't random. It wasn't coincidental. It was the culmination of a divine plan that had been unfolding across millennia. Think about this. The same process that produced the sacred oil used to anoint kings and priests, the oil that burned in the temple lamps, the oil that symbolized healing and blessing, required crushing and pressing so intense that every drop of value was extracted. Jesus, who would become our ultimate king and high priest, submitted to a spiritual crushing so complete that every drop of divine wrath was absorbed. Every debt of human sin was paid. The DNA evidence showing that olive trees at the site descended from ancient stock tells us that early Christians understood something we're only now rediscovering. They knew this place was sacred, not just because of what happened there, but because of what it represented. They preserved not just the memory, but the very genetic heritage of trees that witnessed the most important night in human history. The mikveh discovered beneath centuries of soil reminds us that Gethsemane operated under divine law, producing oil that met the highest standards of purity. How fitting that the one who would become our perfect sacrifice spent his final hours in a place dedicated to producing the purest possible oil through the most complete possible crushing. But here's what strikes me most powerfully about everything we've uncovered. The hematidrosis, the bloody sweat that Luke documented with medical precision, wasn't just a rare physiological phenomenon. It was visible proof that what happened in Gethsemane pushed human nature beyond its limits. The pressure Jesus experienced that night was so intense that his very body testified to the reality of what he was enduring for us. Yet he stayed, he prayed, he submitted. He chose the crushing over escape, the pressing over comfort, the cup of wrath over the path of ease. And in doing so, he produced something infinitely more valuable than olive oil. He produced the redemption that flows to every person willing to receive it. The garden where the first Adam fell became the garden where the last Adam triumphed. The place of crushing became the place of victory. The night of anguish became the dawn of hope. That's what really happened in Gethsemane, and the evidence is still speaking to us today. If this journey has opened your eyes to the depth of Christ's sacrifice, let us know in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the price that was paid for their freedom. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because these biblical mysteries are everywhere, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to dig deeper than the surface. The crushing is complete. The oil has been extracted. The price has been paid. And the invitation to receive what was purchased in that garden of pressing still stands today. That's the message of Gethsemane, echoing across 2,000 years, speaking to every heart willing to listen.